What I want to talk about is the basics. Now, how many times have you watched a professional demo and they say you do this, this, and this, and this is what you get? Well, that's all well and fine, but do this, this, and this. It doesn't really tell you a whole lot. And I think a lot of that is because the professionals, it's become such an intuition to them that they do it automatically without thinking about it. Now, I became a shop teacher in '06, and one of the things that I discovered is the stuff that I did intuitively, the kids didn't understand. So I had to stop and think, how do I explain this to these kids? Because for me, it's so simple. So I started looking at what I was doing here. I've got some PowerPoints here. Now, I'm going to go through real quickly. I'm going to actually skip a lot of it. But I have these PDFs and some videos and stuff on my website. And it's real easy to find my website because it's called MidwestWoodArt.com. We live in the Midwest. I do wood art. So if you can remember that, you can get right to my website, MidwestWoodArt.com. So we start out with this. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. How many of us have done that? Yeah, exactly. So this leads us into our common turning questions. Which tool is the best? What tool angle is the best? What grind angle is the best? What grind profile is the best? And why am I getting so much tear out? Well, I numbered these in the order that I think makes the most sense. And you notice 3, 2, 4, 4. What did I put on the last there? What grind angle and what profile? The number one question, why am I getting so much tear out? That's what you should be focusing on. So, rule number 1, rub the bevel. Rub the bevel, rub the bevel, rub the bevel. And the reason for that is that bevel is what controls the depth of the cut. And I'm going to demonstrate this a little bit more when I get over here. I've got a chisel and a hand plane, actually a couple hand planes, but a hand plane has a sole on it, and that sole guides the iron across the wood, and that is what controls the depth of the cut. That's exactly what the bevel on the tool is doing. You get off of the bevel, and now it's like just sticking the wood chisel straight up and down, and it's going to hit a hard spot, push it up. When you get to a soft spot, it'll dig in. So if you're off the bevel when you're turning, the tool is going to bounce. If you're righting the bevel, now it can glide smoothly through that cut. Real important. The second part of this, for turning is sharpen, 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 sharpen. So when I teach wood turning, I teach a couple continuing ed classes, and I teach at various places. I line up my students, and before they even start the lathe, I tell them, I'm going to ask one question, and this question is your tool sharp? And your automatic answer is going to be, I don't know, let's sharpen it. So once they have those two things, they start turning. I'll walk by it. Is your tool sharp? I don't know. Yeah, let's sharpen it. So we go sharpen it. Or inevitably, I'll walk by. Is your tool sharp? Well, I just sharpened it. Okay, what's the answer? I don't know. Let's sharpen it. So we go over it and we sharpen it. And we spend a lot of time just sharpening. But within about 3 hours, they can feel when the tool is starting to get dull. Okay? An almost sharp tool will almost cut. And I don't know who started that saying, but it's very true. It's got to be sharp, 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 sharp. Okay. And when we get over here, I'm going to go into this a little bit more. You basically have 3 different ways of using the tool. You got a positive rake and negative rake and a zero or a neutral rake. The neutral rake, zero rake, that's your scraper. A positive rake is also how you hold the tool, but if you look at the Hunter carbide tools, they're a cup shape. They have a positive rake built right into them. And the negative rake. And the big buzzword anymore is negative rake scrapers and blah, blah, blah. I don't use a negative rake scraper. I took a week-long workshop with Stuart Batty last year, and just before that, I'd actually had a demo at our club with Tom Worsing. Well, Tom Worsing and Stuart Batty share the same studio, so their theory is the same. They refer to it as a negative rake abrader, and I can get into that just a little bit more. You aren't cutting with the negative rake scraper. You're abrading with it. You're sanding with it. You're just using a very, very fine burr on there, and once that burr's gone, you got to stop and put another burr on it. So we'll get more into that a little bit later. And this kind of goes a little bit more into the theory and everything. Again, this is on my website. If you go to my website, there's a drop-down box called PDFs and videos. You'll find it on there. Okay, so now the next thing is using a gouge is like flying an airplane. I have people ask, what angle are you holding that tool at? And my general answer is, I don't know. Because I am flying that gouge. And you actually have the roll, yaw, and pitch. The roll is how you twist the tool. The yaw would be how you guide the tool going around the radius. And the pitch is how you have the tool up and down like this. It's going to change it from a negative rake to a neutral to a positive rake. You can use all those to your advantage. So let's go a little bit farther here. I'm going to skip over this because I'm going to go over it over there. You gotta watch the grain when you are turning. That is absolutely essential. How many of you have heard the buzzwords push cut, pull cut? I don't like those terms. Push cut. That tool has a cutting edge. It doesn't care if it's being pushed or pulled. A better way of thinking of it is the cutting edge going with the grain? If you're going against the grain, it's just like petting the dog backwards. It's going to raise his fur up. You're going to piss off the dog. So you always want to go with the grain. So keep that in mind. A standard face grain bowl, when you're doing the outside, you start at the middle and you go to the top. To do the inside, you start at the top and go to the middle. That's going with the grain. End grain bowl is absolutely backwards, because an end grain bowl, all you're doing is turning a spindle. Okay? So your movements are going to be just backwards, because a face grain bowl, the grain is going vertically like this. Spindle, it's down like this. Does that make sense to everybody? If you can't understand or have questions, make sure and ask right now. Look at it on my website and stuff. I was turning a box elder bowl one day that had some figure in it. Now, normally when I'm turning, I have my flute about half open. So I'm using the nose angle and part of the wing when I'm roughing. Most everybody does. Problem is, I was getting tear out. Yeah, even with this bad picture here, you can see the tear out, right? And guess what I did? I tried the same thing over and over. I sharpened. I tried, spritzing the wood with water to soften the wood fibers and doing all the same things. I still kept getting the tear out. So it's like, okay, tired of this. Went back over to my grinder to resharpen again. And for some reason, I'm not sure exactly why I did it, but I had something running around the back of my mind. I put a broad nose radius on the nose of the tool. And when I went back to the bowl blank there, I closed the flute. So what my thinking was at that point was, okay, I'm going to use the cutting edge right there on the nose of the tool, but I don't want it at an angle. I want that cutting edge to be almost parallel with the rotation of the wood. So instead of cutting through the wood fibers at an angle, now I'm cutting through, exactly through the side of the wood grain. Tear out disappeared. Just something simple like that. You like that? Okay. So we might come back to this later and might not. Here's something else I like to demonstrate, and I brought this tool along. Got a scraper there. How many of you can get a nice finish with a scraper? Okay. You can get a fairly nice finish. What if you use it like that? You notice I don't have it in a flat position. I'm using it like a gouge. I am rubbing the bevel, and I am using that cutting edge, cutting through the side of the wood grain, so I am slicing through the wood grain rather than trying to go through at an angle. Does that make sense to everybody? I see a few of these. Okay. A lot less tear out. So what I do when I'm turning is I am paying attention to the cutting edge. Because to me, that is all the tool is a cutting edge. Detail gouge. Okay. Regular old spindle gouge, but I watched a video with from Cindy Drozda, and she had resharpened her gouge where she got this real radical profile on it. I won't go too much into this right now, but I had resharpened this on my Wolverine jig one time, and I had a nice big long hollow grind on it, and I went over to my lathe and I tried to turn a spindle, and it was nasty. I didn't use the bad words, but Joni could tell that I wasn't happy. She could hear the catches. It just dug in like crazy. And I thought, okay, maybe I got it too radical. So I went back over to my grinder, and rather than redo the whole profile, I just did the very front part of it. If you look right up here, this is the hollow grind I started with, but from here on is where I corrected that bevel. I shortened the bevel. I went back over to the lathe and it cut like butter. So I found out, okay, long bevel doesn't work. It just makes the tool cut very radically. And if you go through my PDFs and look at them real close, you'll see how I explain why the long bevels cut so aggressively. So I relieve the bevels on all mine. Has anybody ever heard of Johannes Mikkelsen? Makes those cowboy hats. Sells this really nice, real expensive jig so he can put a triple bevel on his tools. I just go over and I just grind off the excess by hand, because what I've figured out is all those extra bevels for is clearance. And if I miss by an inch, it's as good as a mile. So I don't spend a lot of time on those fancy jigs. If you're OCD, you'd probably like them, but I don't waste my time on that. So let's see, what else do we have? Yeah, you can turn the outside of a bowl with a spindle gouge. And if you look, I'm actually using a little bit more of the wing than the nose there. One other thing I wanted to show you. Let's go back to this. Okay, so what angle do you put on that tool? According to Stuart Batty, you use a 40-40 grind, because Stuart has investigated this. He said he had the opportunity to look at some beaver skulls, and he measured the angle of the beaver's fangs and found it was 40 degrees. Of course, I don't know where he was measuring that angle on a radius. But that's what he said. And then he followed that up with, everybody else says the perfect angle is 45 degrees. I have no idea where they came up with that. And I wanted to go, I do. But, there was enough people around, I didn't want to embarrass him. Hand planes, if you look, a hand plane, they mount that iron at a 45 degree angle. And for centuries, woodworkers has recognized that 45 degrees is the perfect angle. Maybe, probably not. Well, if you go through this, excuse me, you'll notice that for different tools, you have different angles. So I kind of surmised that the angle doesn't make a lot of difference. What makes the difference is how it's used and where it's used. If you look at a spindle gouge, a traditional spindle gouge has got a steeper angle than a bowl gouge. The reason the bowl gouge has a more blunt angle, it's so you can get around the inside radius of the bowl. If you've got a steep angle, you can get part of the way into the bowl, but now all of a sudden you're off the bevel and you can't control the tool. So that's the reason why there's a difference in angles. What I've further found out, at least from what I have noticed, is the angle isn't real important. It's what you get used to. It's the predictability of how it cuts. Does that make sense to everybody? So even if you're sharpening at 37 or 43 or whatever, if you get used to that angle, it works better. Okay, what else do we have here? Yeah, this is a little bit more about the angles. Oh yeah, this is something else that I thought was interesting with Stuart. He says 40-40 grind is the best angle. But for his bottom feeding gouges, it's a 60 degree angle. Okay, unless you're doing a calabash, and then if you're doing a calabash bowl, there's part of that bowl that a 50 degree angle is better. Okay, Stuart, is 40 degrees perfect, or is it 40, 50, 60? Where is it? That's again where I'm coming up with. It's what you get used to. And we can go through more of this. By the way, the axes, if you study sharpening axes, there's a way that you can change a general purpose axe into a limbing axe. My brother had a tree trimming surface one time, and he asked me to resharpen his axe for him. Well, it'd been resharpened a few times, and each time he sharpened it, that angle started to get a little broader. Well, I just ground off some of the excess of the cheeks there, and I made it more of a slicing tool, I guess you might call it. Well, we went to cut down this tree, this big old soft maple, and he dropped the big branches, and I picked up the axe and kind of chopped them up a little bit so I could haul them out to the trailer. I took that axe and I was cutting limbs that were 2, maybe even 3 inches in diameter. I could slice through them in one cut. And the owner of the tree looked at me and says, either that axe is real sharp or you're hitting it real hard. And I said, yeah. So, but think about the axe. Okay, everybody has a general purpose axe, and we've resharpened it several times. Now it's got a little bit wider, bevel on it. It's the same thing as trying to chop down a tree with a splitting maul. That doesn't work real well. You got to change the angle to make it work the way you want. So just keep all this stuff in mind as you're playing around with the tools. And this will explain the angles on the bowl gouge, why they're more of a 40, 45 degree angle, because if you've got too steep of an angle, you're going to run into the side of the bowl, and then to try to get across the bottom, you're off the bevel. You can't control the tool. So here's one more thing. This is something that I've experimented with. I've used the wing of the tool in almost a vertical position to do the outside of the bowl, and what I've found is it works. It will give you some really nice curly Q shavings coming off of there, but it's hard to control. When you're using the nose of the tool, you've got a nice long handle to work your way around. You can do a smoother radius with that long handle than you can just turning it with just a 1/2 or 5/8 inch diameter gouge. The other thing that I found, if I have too long of a cutting edge, now the leading part of that cutting edge can get under some of those wood fibers and lift them up before the rest of the tool will cut them off. It will actually induce some tear out. So you got to be careful of that too. So I figured out from that, using the nose radius on my tool, now I have a small, very short cutting edge, so I can slice through the side of the wood fibers more easily. And you've noticed I haven't said too much about shear scraping and shear cutting and stuff like that. For me, shear cutting, I'm working at an angle. It works. But again, if you got the angle, it's going to tend to pull the wood fibers up, and you're still going to get some tear out. So let's go over the lathe over here. So before we get too far into it, we're going to concentrate on this block of wood right here. Okay? Now you remember I said wood turning is all about the wood fibers. So I'm going to pick up this tool here. And I should have sharpened it a little bit more before I came. If we go with the grain, and I have the tool like this, you notice I have a hard time controlling the depth of the cut because it rocks a little bit. But if I lay it down like this, now I can use that long bevel to actually guide that tool so I can get a nice smooth cut. Bevel, rub the bevel, rub the bevel, rub the bevel. That's where that comes from. If I get off the bevel and I try to do the same thing, it's just going to dig in. Okay? So the next part, by the way, this is what I learned when I was a freshman in high school. Our first project, the teacher gave us a block of wood and a hand plane, and we had to make that piece of wood flat, parallel, and square on all surfaces. So the hand plane, you got the sole of the plane in relationship to that cutting edge. That's going to control the depth of the cut. And as I'm going across here, I should get a nice smooth cut. If I'm going the wrong way, what's it going to do? Tear out. It's going to lift the wood up. So now I know I have to turn it around and go the other way. You always pet the dog the correct way. Okay. Something else I kind of discovered is we can do this too. I'm going at an angle. I don't get a smooth surface there, but if you do that, you'll find out that it cuts very aggressively with very little effort. Well, Stanley made what they call a scrub plane. And the scrub plane, it's a little hard to see here, but it's got a big radius on that cutting edge there. So it's going to just kind of scoop the wood out, and the scrub plane is meant to remove a lot of wood very quickly. You don't go with the grain, you can, but it's more intended to go at an angle. Very little effort to remove a lot of wood. This is important to remember. We're going to get there pretty quick. I'm going back to the chisel. Okay, so how often have you seen a carpenter make a saw cut in something, or he'll make a series of saw cuts and then just take a hammer and knock that wood loose? Removes a whole lot of wood with no effort at all. Or the same thing with a wood chisel like this, very little effort, you can remove a lot of wood. Okay, what happens if I do the end grain with hand plane? Has anybody ever hand planed end grain before? What's it like? It sucks. It's tough. You know, it's really hard to cut end grain. And of course, when you get to the other side, what does it do? Breaks it off. Yeah, it just doesn't work well. Keep those principles in mind. And if you need a reminder, get out your hand plane and a block of wood and start practicing. You'll find that sometimes just going at a little angle, it doesn't work too bad, but going right with the end grain, it's hard to do. Okay, so with that in mind, we've got this 4x4 here. How many of you rough turn a bowl with a roughing spindle gouge? Okay, a couple people do. It can work. Just about everybody's going to tell you that is extremely dangerous because the tool's not designed for it. It's got a real thin tang here, so it'll break real easy. Well, that's kind of a symptom, but that's not really what's going on. So, and I like my little spindle gouge here. I use it quite a bit. For me, this tool, all it's used for is doing a straight cut on a spindle. And it's for roughing a spindle down to round. I don't use it to go around a corner. It does not like to go around corners. But here's why you don't want to use them on a bowl. Oh, let me go one more thing too. If you do buy that robust lathe, can you zoom in on this? Okay. This is called a safety center. It's not one of those pronged drive centers. You'll get one of these with your robust lathe. Our club has changed over to these safety centers, and I love them. I didn't think I would, because I do some pretty big pieces of wood, but I've found that I can still drive those big pieces of wood with these safety centers. Big advantage to the safety center is if you hit it too hard, no big deal. Another advantage, especially for the beginners, they forget about checking their tailstock, and it'll kind of work loose, and pretty soon the part comes flying out. Well, with the safety centers, if it comes a little bit loose, you can't cut. So you have to keep that tight, tight, tight. So throw away your prong centers and get the safety centers. You'll like them. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but you'll like them. Okay, so now we're going to do the outside of a bowl. Oops. Let me do this. And can you actually do that? Yes, you can. But why don't you want to do that? This is what happens. So that's why you don't use a roughing gouge on the outside of a face grain bowl. Danger, yeah, a little bit. But what's going to happen is you're just going to rip these wood fibers up. So what's better? Use a bowl gouge and go from the side. A little bit nicer cut, right? Okay, so that's why we have a bowl gouge. And I don't get to tear out. I get a little bit of tear out, but not so much. So I'll just pass the safety center around so everybody can check it out. You can, do the initial part of a face grain bowl between centers. No problem. For me, it's simpler just to screw it to a faceplate. Whenever I buy a new chuck, I've only got 15 chucks. Sorry. Whenever I get one of those new chucks, it's always got one of those big screw things that go in the center. I take that out and I just throw it in the garbage, because I found out that if I use that single screw there and I get a little catch, now try and get that screw out. So I just throw them away. I just screw it to a faceplate, and I use sheet metal screws. I don't use wood screws, and I don't use drywall screws. Wood screws are soft and they'll break. Drywall screws are brittle and they'll break. Sheet metal screws are in between. They're tough. They're strong and tough. And I use the hex head because I found out that if I've used the Phillips head, the Phillips strips out and then they're hard to get out. But the hex just works real good. I can screw them in and out and reuse them over and over and over, and it holds real well. You notice I've only got 3 screws here. That's really all I need, because I keep my tools sharp. Sharp, 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 sharp. Okay. So I want to check I'm not hitting anything. Actually, I've got it centered pretty well. I'll turn the RPMs down just a little bit. And I'm going to start out. This is what I learned from Stuart Batty, and I like it real well. He likes to get the outside running true, and then he'll true up the face. Now, when he gets the outside true and round, he knows where the stopping place is. Getting the face flat, when you start to cut, the tool isn't bouncing back and forth. You've got a nice flat face to start. It just makes everything easier to start. One difference that I do with when I'm roughing the outside that's a little different than Stuart, and for most right-handers is going to start on this side and go across. That's typical, right? I start on this side and I go back. Kind of do it left-handed. I have a very good reason for doing that. If I go this way, I throw shavings over in a pile here, and then I finish the rest, and I throw the shavings in a pile over there. But if I start on this side, now I throw all the shavings in one pile. Make sense? No? So, speed. Speed kills, right? But when you're running that hand plane, you'll probably notice that if you go real slow, you really have to push that hand plane to get it to cut. But if you speed up, it'll kind of glide through the wood. So that's kind of what I'm doing here. And with Stuart Batty, I figured I would try and set a good example for everybody. So I had my lathe speed down. Stuart kept coming over and turning it up. You're going too slow, you're going too slow. Well, I just tried to show a good example. At home, I go a lot faster than that. Right here, I'm about 726, it says. That's about what I turn at home until I get it balanced, and then I'll crank it up. So I'm going to take a cut. I'll have the flute halfway open, and I'm going to be rubbing the bevel for the first cut. You ready? By the way, you should never look away from the tool when you're doing this. You should always keep your eye on it, right? I figure if blind people can turn, so can I. Okay, I've got it roughly round there. I'm going to take another more shallow cut just to clean it up a little bit more. And let's speed it up a little bit more now that it's balanced. And that looks pretty good. So I've got it roughed out. I've got a little bit of tear out on the end grain here, but it's just roughed. So next thing to think about, I'm taking small cuts and I'm using a sharp tool. You remember I said I only have 3 screws here? What I see a lot of people do when they're beginning is they're going to try and replicate my turning style, and they're going to be pushing that tool, and it's going to be dull. They're putting a lot of leverage against this workpiece, and they're going to lever it right off the faceplate, and it'll get thrown at them. Whereas I am moving more linear, it's a smoother motion. I've got a sharper tool. I'm not putting a lot of work force or leverage on the workpiece, so no problem at all. And you notice I don't have the tailstock in the way. I've watched people do the inside of a bowl with the tailstock in there, and I don't do that because it just flat out gets in my way. I'll go over that in a little bit later here. So next thing I want to do is just flatten the face. And this, I'm going to be off the bevel. I'm using the tool rest to guide the tool, and it's just a rough cut, so now I've got rid of it. I'll turn this at a little bit of an angle, and now I can take a cut. And I'm getting down there sort of close. Take another rough cut here. Tool's getting a little bit dull, so next thing I want to do is put a tenon on it. And you can buy high dollar tenon tools. My high dollar tenon tool is just it was either a round nose scraper or whatever. I've cut it to like an 80-degree angle so I can just push it in like this and cut my tenon. There it is. And if you look closely, I do have a dovetail there. If it's not cleaned up real well, which with soft maple it doesn't like to clean up real well, I will use my spindle gouge. And I always put a little divot right in the center of that. I'm going to get out my spindle gouge here and just make it a little bit prettier. And now I have a nice tenon on there. So I'm at the point where I can finish doing the outside. So, sharpen, 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 sharpen. So I'm going to sharpen. I have my grinder set up so I can put this along here anywhere. And I have my tool preset so I can spend a lot of time grinding it. And it's sharp. Okay. So now I'm going to finish roughing the shape that I want. And with it sharper, I've just pretty much got rid of all of that bounce. One thing you might not have noticed, I got over to here and it's starting to bounce a little bit. I just stopped, and then I started again, and I got past that bounce. So, whenever I have a beginner and they say, the tool is bouncing, what do? I'll tell them the first thing you want to do is just stop and let that tool catch up with the cut, and then proceed with it and work your way around. You might need to slow down a little bit. Okay, can you get a close-up on the finish here? Next thing to remember when I'm doing bowls like this, or actually any turning, I think of it as I am turning end grain 100%. I'm not concerning myself with the side grain because that cuts so easy and it'll stay nice and smooth. But we have end grain. Every other revolution is end grain. As I'm going around, remember I said it's like flying an airplane. I'm going to be micro adjusting my roll here and maybe a little bit of the pitch. And of course the yaw is going to change here. As I'm going around, I'm actually changing from side grain to end grain. And it'll change the way the tool reacts with the wood or the wood reacts with the tool. Okay, I've got a fairly smooth finish here. The end grain, I do have a little bit of tear out. So my rule of thumb is every finish cut I resharpen. I just resharpened, right? Okay, I'm going to resharpen. This is a Thompson tool. I like the Thompsons, and I use the CBN wheels. The other thing I'm going to do with the finish cut is I'm going to slow down. So I'll start my cut. I've got my flute pretty well closed. And I just go right around, starting to get just a little bit of a bounce there, so I just hesitated a little bit. You know, you spend a lot of effort in doing this finish cut. And I've changed the shape just slightly. I like the OG cut. Okay, can you get a close-up of the end grain now? You want to come up and take a look? We got a couple. Anybody want to come up and take a look at my tear out here? Oh, got a volunteer.
Very nice. I don't see any.
Okay.
Little color change I can see, but I can't feel it. Very good.
So, how many of you like to sand? Not me. By keeping the tool sharp and going slow. The tool sharp, of course, you understand that. Going slow, the way to think of that, has anybody ever seen the movie American Virgin? 40-year-old American Virgin. You know, the part where he's laying on the table and they put this wax on and they rip it off. By the way, that wasn't a planned stunt. That was literal. Steve Carroll had never had that done, didn't know what to expect. So when they ripped that fur off of him, his reaction was exactly correct. They left it in a movie because it was perfect. Okay, so if I'm going real fast and I'm taking a real heavy cut, that's what I'm doing, is I'm ripping out a lot of those wood fibers. By slowing down, it's more like taking 1 or 2 hairs at a time. There's still, you feel it a little bit, but not like if you're ripping 1,000 out at once. So I am cutting through those wood fibers real slow. Okay? What if I don't like this finish? What if I want to change it just a little bit? What should I do? What do I always do? Sharpen. I'm going to change it just slightly. It is that vital. Had supper with a few of the guys from the club last night, and one of the members, I won't mention names, but he said, I have my sharpening set up real handy. He does his turning out in the garage, and his sharpener is in the house in the basement under the steps behind the furnace. So what he does is he just roughs out everything. Then when he wants to finish, now he'll go into the house and, you know, down the steps, and he'll sharpen, and he'll come back, and then he'll finish turn everything. I sharpen every finished cut. So I have my grinders set up. Actually, my lathe is here. My grinders are set up here. I got 2 of them at home because I got various setups for angles and whatnot. But it is that vitally important to resharpen. So I'm going to give this just a little bit more of an OG shape. Had a little bit of a bounce there, so I hesitated. It left a little bit of a line there, but by the way, how many of you can take a final cut and never have to sand? Me either. I always have to sand, so I don't worry too much about it. But now I've got a little bit more of an OG shape, and you want to come and check my finish again?
Just as good. Nice.
How about where those knots are?
Clean.
So, sharp, sharp, sharp. Take thin, light cuts. Now we're ready to do the inside of the bowl. And take this off. And my tool here. By the way, how many of you use the 2-inch jaws on your chuck? Okay. How many of you use the bigger? Why? Okay. Pretty good answer. This tenon is 4 times as strong as the tenon for there. How many of you broken tenons when you're turning? Switch to the bigger jaws. That tenon is 4 times as strong. So, that's why I use the big tenon all the time, even on some of the smaller bowls. If it's a bowl, 6 inches in diameter or smaller, I'll use the smaller jaws, but I prefer the bigger ones. Now, there's also a school of thought that you want to turn that tenon so it fits the exact radius of those jaws. Don't believe it. Okay? Especially when you're turning green wood, if you're rough turning, leave them big because you're going to have to return it after it dries because it's going to go oval shape. So you leave it nice and big, and now you've got 8 points of those jaws that's going to dig into the wood, and it's wet and it's soft, so it's going to dig in and hold it nice and tight. Not a big deal. So just because they're experts doesn't mean that they really are thinking through what they're doing. Okay, so now, not too bad. Okay, so first thing I want to do is flatten the face. So now when I start my cut, the tool isn't going to be starting with a bounce. Now this is the way that just about everybody does a bowl. We start here and we just work our way out. And I did it that way for years and years and years. In fact, Stuart Batty starts this way too. Okay? Now, if I had the center in there, what would my problem be? Now I have to try and turn the inside of this, but my tool is running into the tool rest. It forces me to use an odd angle. Sometimes the flute is too open. It's going to cause a catch. And if you got a catch, then it pulls the part out. That's why they put the center in there, so they're actually causing their own problems. I'm not having any problem turning here, right? Okay, so now, Stuart Batty, the way he does it, remember how I showed you I took that chisel and I just ripped some wood off? Okay, I'm going to do the same thing, except I'm going to turn it like this. And this is the way Stuart Batty does it. Takes almost no effort to do that. I've changed Stuart Batty's method just a little bit. I start out here, and I'll do my initial cut like that. Now I'm going to flip the tool over, and I'll do this. I just flip it over. Now, the advantage of doing it this way, for me, is I can stand straight up. Doing it Stuart's way, I'm leaning over the lathe. Not real comfortable, right? Well, me, I'm lazy. I'd rather stand up straight and do this. And this just rips the wood off. They call it a planing cut. No problem at all. Well, about a year ago, I was on this Facebook web page. It was Woodturners Around the World or something like that. And I'd noticed that there was several people had posted a video of how they did the inside of a bowl. And one guy's sitting on his lathe and, doing all this. And, most of the time they're doing this. By the way, you get down to here and it doesn't like to cut, right? Well, I would get down to the middle here, and it just doesn't like to cut. And I don't know why, but I just automatically switched the tool over and did this, and it just cut effortlessly. Never thought about it until I started working with Stuart Batty and saw him doing that out here, and I thought, okay, now that makes sense. Now I know why I'm doing it. I am just using a scrubbing cut or a planing cut. No problem at all. So anyhow, I had Joni do a video of me roughing the inside of a bowl. It was about 11-inch bowl like this. I posted it on Facebook, and I didn't pay a lot of attention until I looked at the time on the Facebook post, and it was 90 seconds. Yeah, I turned the inside of a soft maple bowl in 90 seconds. There's one guy on there from New Jersey. You're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. Excuse me. And I kept saying, no, I'm doing it right. No, you're doing it wrong. He wanted me to do it the traditional way. So this went on for a little bit, and then there was another guy got on there, and the guy says, I do it much the same way. That guy's name was Richard Raffin. So I guess if I'm doing it the same way as Richard Raffin, I must be doing it right. So that's another neat part about this. You can aim those shavings where you want. And you have to look real close, but I will make slight adjustments as I'm turning. And it's hard for me to show because it's so automatic to me. After you do a few hundred of these, it's second nature. That wood's coming off there pretty easy. This way I'm cutting end grain. This way, when I turn it over, I'm doing that peeling cut. So it's just a lot less effort. And I just keep going until it's done. By the way, I get to a certain point and I have to speed it up a little bit. I'm taking really big, heavy cuts here, right? Look at the thickness of the shavings. I'm not producing real heavy shavings. I'm not pushing the tool. I'm not forcing it to cut. I'm letting it cut. When you let it cut, you don't have tool pressure. I don't need a whole lot of tail stock out here to hold it in place. I could actually use a smaller tenon than that, and I have before too. But no problem. And it's really handy when you get down to the center there. You aren't fighting to get over center of it.
You got any good batteries, Jerry?
There, we had it for a moment. Well,
Yeah, they're dead. That was from out.
come over here and look at it. Okay.
Clean with his butt.
I love it. Okay, so typically when people turn, they're going like this, right?
Yes, sir.
What I'm doing is I'm turning the tool like this, and I'm using the wing to go in.
Planing cut.
A planing cut. Now, the guy that I was telling you about that said I was doing it wrong, he says, you're not rubbing the bevel. You're not rubbing the bevel. No, I was rubbing the bevel because I had this cone out here, and I was pushing against that cone, which helped me guide it right into there.
Leverage.
Okay? Make sense?
Yes, sir.
Anybody else want to see that right handy or right quick? So, well, that's all right. I'm going to speed it up just a little bit so I can take a little bit more of a cut so you can see a nice heavy cut.
Seems to me that's how we were talking when we took classes here.
Yep, that's how everybody does it. But now, notice I'm going to turn it over like this.
Okay.
And see where the bevel's rubbing? Right on that shoulder? Yeah, instead of here, I'm rubbing there.
Okay.
And the same way here. So I am rubbing against this piece here. So if you want to think of it this way, I'm doing the outside of the bowl on the inside. When I'm doing the outside of the bowl, I'm rubbing this surface. Well, that surface is right there. And you notice how the tool is bouncing? Okay, how do we get rid of that? Get closer. Does that help? Worse? Okay. So that's what I'm doing. And of course, when you're doing a small diameter like that, you want to use a higher speed. But I am pushing against this knob there. And I just feed it in. Okay? Traditionally, I'm going to try and go this way, which works until I get down so small, and then I just can't hardly push it past that center. But if I turn it over on its side, it's just effortless.
When you're doing the steps, how do you match the bottom without getting those little lines in there? You're still gonna straight and even?
When I'm roughing there, I leave those lines in there. Each step, I'm going to stop just short so I don't run into it. So how do I get rid of the lines? Simple. I turn it over and I do a traditional cut and I get rid of those lines. Does that make sense? So all I'm doing is roughing. I'm ripping that excess wood out of the center. But to get the middle of it smooth, what do I do now? Sharpen. Sharpen. So I'm going to sharpen. Yeah. This is a good point. I'm going to go over this right now. You know, a traditional tool's got a real short handle on it, so you don't have a whole lot of leverage. But with a longer handle, not only do I have more leverage, I can take it off, so it's not a counterbalance as I'm trying to sharpen, but I've got a lot better leverage. So now, when I'm trying to do the inside of a bowl, if I got a short tool, if I move it a little out here, it moves a lot down here. Whereas if I've got a nice long handle, I move it a little out here and it hardly moves it all down here. So I can control that radius a lot better. Okay? How many of you use an inside bowl scraper? Catch like crazy, right? Horrible things. But if you put a handle on them, yeah, it's carbon fiber. Stuff that Stuart Batty has. So, with this, I don't get a catch. The other thing is, this is ground to a negative rake. Let me take a finish cut on the inside of the bowl, and we're going to go over the negative rake a little bit. So, finish cut. I do it traditionally, except I want to go just a little bit faster. Now you notice I'm getting down here and I've got this big knob there, right? That's hard to cut. What do? I turn the tool over and I use my planing cut to get rid of the excess, flip it back where it was, pick it up and go through, and it's done. So I've got a finished turn bowl here. Yes. Okay. Yeah, we'll just start with you over here. V and U shape. Now, I do have my U-shaped bowl gouge here, and That U-shape has a big broad radius on the nose. That could be an advantage and a disadvantage. This I actually have sharpened to a bottom feeder, and Stuart likes a bottom feeder. So he will do down to the bottom of the bowl with this tool. He'll lay this down, he'll pick this up, and then he'll feed through with his bottom feeder, which, does work. This does not like to work on the side, but it does like to work on the bottom. It's sharpened at a 60-degree angle. Me, like I said, I do things just a little bit different. I get down to the point where I should change over to the bottom feeder. Instead of changing the tool, I just flip it over, do the peeling cuts, flip it back, and finish through with the cut, and it's done. Rather than using two tools, I do it all with one tool. Yeah, I use the V. Okay. I also have a David Ellsworth, which is an elliptical flute, and his theory is it releases the chips better, so you get a smoother cut. Again, we are treating a symptom rather than the cause. I don't care about that because I've never had a problem with my flute plugging up with chips. They always come flying out, as you can kind of see over here. So, there's an advantage and disadvantage. Fluteless gouges, and I should have taken a cut with my fluteless gouge. Let's see what I have over here. I did bring some stuff with me. Here we go. Yeah, let's play with this. By the way, when I said that I rough turned the inside of a bowl in 90 seconds, there it is. So, let's flip this around, and I have smaller jaws on that. Do we have a chuck key for this tool? Or this chuck, I should say. And do I have a better one? Oh, okay. Joni says I'm taking too much time. Let's see. I should have brought my other little chuck with me. Okay. Will it fit? Nope. Yeah, it's just that my tenon that I use here is too small, but I think we can get around that. I'm going to jam chuck it, just so I can show you how I use my fluteless bowl gouge. By the way, Thompson sells a fluteless bowl gouge, and I bought one of them to experiment with. They're nasty. Nasty, nasty, nasty. I like my homemade fluteless bowl gouge. Okay. So, this should work. Notice I said should. Okay. My fluteless bowl gouge, commonly known as a 1/2-inch scraper, but you notice it's sharpened at a rather steep angle. So I'm going to sharpen it right quick. Okay. One of my friends, he's passed away now. His name was Rick Reeves. And Rick was a tool and die maker, and he bought a wood lathe just to play around with in his garage in Waverly, Iowa. And he was on a busy street, and people would stop by and, "What you doing?" He would show them what he was doing, and "Could you make this? Could you fix this?" And Oh yeah, so he kept doing that. He got so busy he had to quit his job and start doing wood turning full time. He had one lady stop by with a spinning wheel, an antique spinning wheel, and she said, "Could you make some repair parts for this?" And Rick says it was love at first sight. He fell in love with spinning wheels. Now you think of the spinning wheels, got all those spokes in it and the legs and everything, all those turn parts on a spinning wheel. He turned every one of those by hand. He didn't use a duplicator because it slowed him down. He did this for 35 years. How many spinning wheels do you think he could make? 35? More guesses? 100? Another guess? 11,000. Yeah. And that's only half of the stuff that he made, by the way. He said he was a wood turner for 35 years, and it was like I was on vacation for 35 years. This guy, running this in and out, he started out with Delta lathes, and he wore out 3 tailstocks, so he replaced the quill with a pneumatic cylinder, because it took several seconds to do this, where a pneumatic cylinder is, in and out. He would turn the lathe on in the morning and didn't turn it off until he left at night, and he left it running full speed all day long. He would change parts with it running full speed. I could show you how he did that, which is real simple, but I won't. But that just kind of goes to show you. Well, I was watching Rick turning one time. This was after he retired, and he had a scraper, and he was getting these beautiful ribbons coming off of the scraper. And I says, "Hey, Rick, what angle do you have that ground at?" And he laughs, says, "I don't know." Says, "I'll let the experts worry about what the right angle is." My thought is, this is a guy that's been doing this for 35 years. He's managed to make 11,000 spinning wheels. I think he's the expert. And when I looked at a scraper, it was sharpened to about a 45-degree angle rather than the 70 or 80 that most people use. So anyhow, I took my scraper, my robust, I'm sorry. And all it is a cutting edge. So I am rubbing the bevel and with the tailstock in the way, it forces me to use an angle I'm not real comfortable with. But let's see what we can get. This I have sharpened to a negative rake. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about negative rake, positive rake, and neutral rake. I want to demonstrate that for you now. Need your camera right over here. Everybody see that all right? This is the easiest way to understand how a negative rake works. Negative rake doesn't like to cut because it's trying to hold the wood fibers down as it goes. So here is a negative rake. And using a negative rake, you see how it just spreads that jelly nice and even across there. What if I use a scraper position? I'm scraping the jelly off, right? Positive rake. Now it's digging in to the toast. Does that make sense? That's what the negative rake is all about. It is trying to hold the wood fibers down as it goes. It doesn't want to cut. Bevels. When we're using this 8-inch diameter wheel over here, we are putting a hollow grind bevel on the tool. And when you do that, you're going to have 2 points on that hollow grind. You're going to have the leading edge and the trailing edge. The trailing edge is going to work as a fulcrum, and it's going to allow that front edge to dig in. So if you have a real long hollow grind, now it's going to really dig in more aggressively. So that's part of the reason why I relieve the bevel. So I have a shorter bevel there. A flat grind. Now a flat grind, to get those to work, you have to bring it up off of the bevel, just like this. So you are concentrating everything right on that cutting edge. It's a little bit harder to control. I can feel the difference between a flat grind and a hollow grind. Some people can't because they're used to it, but I can feel it. And then there is the convex grind. The convex grind, I'll pass this around. The convex grind doesn't want to cut at all. It's just like a wood carving tool. It's designed so when you start to cut in the wood, you just rock it a little bit and it comes right back up out of the cut. So it doesn't like to cut. And that's what I use on my spindle gouges. I sharpen them by hand. Now Joni, on the other hand, she uses my Wolverine to do her spindle gouges. She's used to the hollow grind and it works better for her. But for me, I like the the convex grind, and I just do it by hand. It's quicker and easier, blah blah blah. So grinds, what's the best grind? Do you use this 8-inch diameter wheel, or do you use the Sorby belt sander, or do you do it by hand? It's all entirely up to you. It's what you get used to. It's the predictability of the cut. Questions? Oh, somebody's got to have questions. Come on. Okay, the angle on my bowl gouge, I learned how to do the 40-40 with Stuart Batty. I spent 5 days with him, and by the 5th day, I was finally able to do it. He gave me a 99. He said there's no such thing as 100, so I guess I kind of nailed it. And I also bought the Ellsworth jig. Well, I don't like the Ellsworth jig because it's a little fussy. So I just adjusted my Wolverine so I could duplicate those angles on there, which gives you an approximation of the 40-40, but it's not exact. And I actually spent probably 3 months switching back and forth, trying to figure out which one was better. And what I figured out was, yeah, that was it. I couldn't find the difference, so I've switched back to the Wolverine simply because I can sharpen it a lot faster than I can do it by hand. Doing it by hand, I'll show you how long it takes me, because I have this set up as a 40-40. And I've got this all laid out, and actually I'm a little off of the 40-40, so I'll return it to the 40-40 now. And this side's a little closer. But you notice it takes me a little bit longer to do that. So that's why I don't do the 40-40. Stuart Batty, after having done this for thousands and thousands of bowls and who knows how many hours, he can do it quicker by hand than he can with the Wolverine. I can't because I haven't practiced it enough, but I haven't really found that it cuts any better than an Ellsworth grind or whatever. More questions? By the way, this is all personal, opinion, and everybody's got their own ideas, and that's fine too.
How fine are your grinding?
Good question. I have one grinder set up with an 80 and a 180, and the other with 320 or 350 and a 600. I also have a 1,000 grit wheel that I played with for a while too, and the one I was using was a 600, but the one I did the 40/40 with was a 350. I haven't seen a whole lot of difference in the grit of the wheel. In fact, for a while, I could sharpen on an 80 grit wheel and get a nice smooth finish, but I kind of relegated my 80 grit wheel just to roughing and for doing my negative rake scrapers, which, my negative rake scraper. Okay. Everybody calls it a skew, right? Now let me switch this platen around so I can put a burr on it. And I'll put the burr on with the 350, which will work. Yep. Might be just a little bit warm. The burr is going to be on this side. Now, again, the negative rake scraper, properly used, it's a negative rake abrader. We got a question over here. Okay. You want to come over here? And I'll just show you. Anybody want to see this? Come on over. What did I do with my bowl gouge? I just had it. I don't think I passed it around. Did I pass around one of my gouges? Not with the wooden handle, but this handle? No, I just laid it down. Yeah. Isn't that interesting? I lost it in the shavings a bit. Oh, here's why. I left it out of Lyndal. So come over here. And the 40/40. Stuart even made a nice little gauge for measuring the 40-degree angle. And the angle from here to here is exactly 40 degrees. If you see these scribe lines, those are 40 degrees. So now I can bring the wing up, line it up with that line there, and I can grind that to 40 degrees. By the way, you want this flute to be laying parallel with the platen, and then when you swing it around, it stays at 40/40. So I have a 40-degree angle on the wing and all the way around the nose over to the other wing. Does that make sense? So I'm just grinding it and bringing it around. 40/40. Yeah. Yeah, I spend the most time doing the wing because there's more metal there to grind, and it doesn't take long to go across the nose. There's not much metal there, so the less time you spend there, the better. And now I've got 40 and 40 on there. And that is absolutely the perfect grind. You shouldn't use anything else unless you really want to, like I do. Okay. It's what you get used to.
You just cut this back so it's out of your way.
Yeah. Go ahead and pass that around. You can pass this around too. Yeah, I just grind the bevel away just for clearance. And it works really well on the inside of a bowl. If you've got a long bevel and you go along the inside of a bowl, you'll get a little hump in there. Well, once you get that hump in there, now the tool wants to rock around going over those humps that it leaves in there, and you get a wavy surface on the inside of a bowl. If you have a real short bevel, 1/8 of an inch or less, now it's going to move smoothly around the inside of a bowl so you can get a nice smooth radius. More questions? No more questions? Okay. Does anybody want some toast? How about you, dear? Yeah. The carbon fiber handles I got from Woodworkers Emporium. Stuart Batty doesn't manufacture tools anymore. There's a long story on that, but he had an investor that kind of liked to keep the money rather than put it back into the business, and the investor bankrupted Stuart Batty. So what stock that he had left, Woodworkers Emporium in Las Vegas, Nevada, bought out. Now remember, it's a finite supply. These, I'm trying to think what they're called, bolsters or something like that, I think they call them. I think I bought the last of the 5/8 diameter. I bought a bunch of handle material because I do hollowing, and I had this idea when I was working with Stuart. You know, they were talking about how stiff the carbon fiber was and everything, and I thought, I'm going to see if I can make a boring bar out of this carbon fiber because it's so stiff. Yeah, it was kind of, sort of. Well, I bought 30 foot of it and ended up just turning it into handles because it didn't work as well for the boring bars as I'd hoped. But you can buy the carbon fiber handles yet from Woodworkers Emporium. And I love my robust American Beauty, and I have a couple of their quick change collets. I don't like them. And the reason I don't like them is because I can't twist them tight enough to hold the tool. They'll work loose and then the tool spins. The Stuart Batty, you know, it's got that nice long taper on them. They'll tighten up real easy. And sometimes I'll get them stuck, but there's a special tool that Stuart sells that just bolts right to the bench so you can unscrew them real easy. I just like these that much better. So let's try this now. Let's see if we can chuck on this. I asked for a piece of punky wood. One of my club members brought a chunk of wood over one day, and it was kind of punky. Well, he likes scraping, and you can kind of imagine what a scraper does with punky wood. Just tore it up like crazy. So I said, let's try it with my tool and my method. And I took a nice cut, and he found out that I had very little tear out. And I says, okay, that's all well and good, but let's take a finish cut. And what do I do when I take a finish cut? Sharpen. And I took a finish cut. We'll see if this works. Sharp tool, move slow. So you can go through, the process of adding super glue or cactus juice or whatever, lacquer, polyurethane to stiffen up that punky stuff. Or you can use a very sharp tool and go very slow through the punky and it'll work. Okay? So I've covered the positive rake, negative rake, neutral rake, sharp, 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 sharp. Okay? Rub the bevel, rub the bevel, rub the bevel. Go with the wood grain. And what happens when you go against the wood grain? Any other questions? Does anybody do anything? Yeah, we got a question back here. Does anybody do anything differently? Inevitably, I hear people say, well, I do it this way. And, if they do it that way and it works for them, there is nothing wrong with that at all. I'm not the last word on this. This is just what I have found that works for me. I'm not going to do the shear scraping because I can get by without. And I just read a PDF by somebody, I don't remember who it was, and they used a tool to put a burr on a scraper just like you would with the card scrapers for woodworking. And he was using that and he was getting a nice finish. What he didn't point out, or maybe he didn't even realize, when he presented that cutting edge of that burr to the wood, he had it at an angle, and it was a positive rake tool, but he was using it with the grain, and it was slicing the wood off. He wasn't scraping with it. Okay, so slice the wood, slice the wood, slice the wood. I can't say enough about that. Anything else? Yes?
How much of this technique thought goes into non-wooded objects? In other words, the acrylics, the corians,
Acrylic, corian, stuff like that has no grain to it whatsoever. It doesn't care what direction you go. Simple as that.
so you still sharpen the same.
I still sharpen the same. Now, Joni, wherever she went, does a lot of acrylics. She uses the Hunter tools because the Hunter tool has a carbide insert. Did I bring mine with me? No, I didn't. Okay. She uses the carbide inserts. They stay sharp longer than the high-speed steel when you're doing the acrylics, because the acrylics are a little tougher. I've also done black locust bowls. Has anybody heard of black locust? It's the hardest, heaviest, most rot-resistant wood in North America. The old timers said that one black locust fence post would outlast 3 post holes. Okay, so as hard as that stuff is, I switch over to my Hunter carbide tools and do that. Something that I didn't show you before, but I'm going to show you now. Got a nice piece of wet, soft maple here. And again, I'm using my safety centers here. Does anybody spend any time with Alan Lacer? He's terrific, isn't he? He knows the skew. Well, I've got an axe to grind. Okay, so here I've got a skew. And that's the advantage of those safety centers. There's a knot in there somewhere. And with a skew, you have to rub the bevel. Absolutely, if you get off that bevel, it digs in like crazy. But you can get some really nice shavings with a skew. And at some point, the handle gets in the way. And I'm getting off the bevel. That's why I'm getting those bounces. Okay. Has anybody ever got a run back like that? What causes the run back? Anybody know? What causes that is you're presenting that cutting edge at an angle. And you present that cutting edge at an angle, it wants to continue that angle, it is going to cut threads. So to get around that, you present it perfectly square with the wood, and it won't run off on you. The other thing is, guess what? It's a little dull. And there's another reason for it being a little dull. I'm going to switch to this other platen over here because it works better. This one here. Joni's granddaughter and her husband came to visit last week, and I turned the top for them with this hatchet, which turned out no problem at all. But they decided they wanted some s'mores, so they're building a fire. Well, the grandson just happened to know where the hatchet was, so he could make some kindling. That's why it was a little dull. It should cut a little bit better now once I get on the bevel. And get it supported here. There we go. Cuts a little better, but I should be able to do something like this too. Just like a skew does. And the run back, because I started at a little bit of an angle. And of course you can't take too heavy of a cut with something like this. Watched a YouTube video, well, it's been a couple months ago, that I thought was kind of cute. Got a little bounce there, so don't have the best finish. But all that is a cutting edge. Let's see if I can. I was doing this real good the other day when I was practicing. It requires a little bit more control because I don't have much of a bevel there that I'm writing. But as you can see, I can get some pretty nice shavings off of that. So whenever you're turning, just think it's a cutting edge. All you concern yourself is the cutting edge. The shape isn't totally important. Okay. Alan Lacer came to our club and did a demo on skews and everything, and this is the best way to get a finish and blah blah blah. And then the second day, the hands-on, he sat down. He wasn't doing a whole lot, and I walked over to him and said, Alan, I can get the same finish with this spindle gouge as you can with your skew. Yeah. So, can I get a nice finish with this? How about that? Nice heavy cut. Somebody want to check that finish? Sharp tool. Yeah. Now we use the wing. And again, nice finish. So this is my skew. I can do everything with this tool that somebody can with a skew, except for maybe a planing cut, because the skew's a little bit wider. And a planing cut, did I get my, my other skew. So a little planing cut with a skew, that works pretty good. I don't use skews, as you can tell. I have been known to demonstrate turning the outside of a bowl with a skew. I do not recommend that in any fashion. It is extremely difficult to do. You have to rub that bevel all the way through the cut and watch, because on a bowl you're doing end grain twice every revolution, and that tool is going to react differently through every revolution. So, have I bored you to death too much yet? Okay. Well, I guess that's what I have. If nobody has any more questions, comments, or anything. Yes?
What do you think about carbide tools?
Easy Wood, I don't own them. Now, I'm going to use my Easy Wood scraper here. Okay, this is not an Easy Wood scraper. The advantage of the Easy Wood scraper is it's a scraper. You can go any direction you want and it's going to cut, but you aren't going to get a finish with it, right? Because it's just scraping the wood off. How do you get around that? Just like that. You turn it at an angle and you use it to slice through the wood. And now you can get a finish. But the carbide Easy Wood tools have such a blunt bevel on them, it's hard to do that, but it can be done. I did a demo at a wood show one time, and I left my tools at home. All I had with me was my negative rake scraper, so I spent the whole day turning spindles with my negative rake scraper, which worked, and nobody really knew the difference, but I was getting finishes like this. Okay, so carbide tools. Now, that being said, I have the flat carbide inserts that I use on my hollowing tools, because when I'm inside a vase, I'm just removing a whole lot of wood. I'm just roughing it out. So the scrapers will work just fine inside, but when I want to get a finish on the inside of the vase, now I have to turn those carbides more of at an angle so they will slice through the wood rather than scrape through it, and then I can get a relatively good finish with it. But otherwise, the only other carbide tools I use are Mike Hunter's. They're just the best. More questions? I could keep going if you want. Does this help anybody? Does it kind of answer some questions on why you're having problems? That's what I want to hear. You know, that I've had people say, you know, I've done that before, but I didn't know why. Now I know why I do it and why it works. So it was well worth my time. So guess I can turn it back over to the boss.